I was standing in the hallway of Mercy General Hospital, still wearing the same wrinkled button-down I'd slept in, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I assumed it was my wife. She had gone home to shower and grab a change of clothes for me, and I figured she was calling to ask if I needed anything else. I almost didn't look at the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pull it out. The name on the screen stopped my heart. It was my daughter, who was lying 30 feet away in the ICU, unconscious, connected to a ventilator, with a brain bleed that the neurosurgeon had described as serious but stabilizing. My daughter, who had not opened her eyes in 4 days. My daughter, who could not speak, could not move, could not in any conceivable way send a text message. And yet there it was. Dad, don't react when you read this. Don't tell anyone. Just come to the nurse's station on the 3rd floor and ask for Elena. She'll explain everything. I love you. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I looked up and down the hallway as if someone was going to jump out and tell me this was some kind of mistake. The fluorescent lights hummed. A nurse walked past without looking at me. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, and the particular kind of dread that only exists when someone you love is fighting to survive. I walked to the elevator. Let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because none of this will make sense without the 4 days that came before that text message. My daughter's name is Caroline. She is 34 years old. She teaches 2nd grade at an elementary school in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she has the kind of laugh that fills up a whole room. She got that from her mother. She has my stubbornness, which she would tell you herself if she were awake. She married her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law, because that's what he was. Even if the word makes me sick to say now 6 years ago at a small outdoor ceremony in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I walked her down the aisle. I cried. I am not a man who cries easily, and I cried. His name was Derek. Is Derek. I keep catching myself using the past tense, which tells you something about how I feel about him, even though he is, unfortunately, still very much alive. Derek was charming. That is the word everyone used. Charming. He had an easy smile and a firm handshake, and he remembered the names of people he'd only met once, which is a quality that impresses people more than it should. He worked in commercial real estate. He made good money, or said he did. He drove a truck that was too expensive, and wore a watch that was too expensive, and talked about investment opportunities in a way that made you feel like you were the one being left behind if you didn't get excited about it. I didn't trust him. I want to be honest about that. I didn't trust him from the beginning, and I told my wife this on more than one occasion, and she told me I was being overprotective, and she was probably right, and for 6 years I kept my mouth shut and watched him make my daughter happy, and I thought maybe I was wrong about him. I was not wrong about him. 4 days before that text message, Caroline was driving home from school on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A driver ran a red light on Glenwood Avenue and hit her car on the driver's side. The impact was bad enough that the paramedics had to cut her out of the vehicle. She was airlifted to Mercy General. By the time my wife and I drove the 2.5 hours from our home in Charlotte, she was already in surgery. The neurosurgeon came out to talk to us at 11:30 that night. He said the surgery had gone well. He said the bleeding had been controlled. He said she was in a medically induced coma to allow the swelling to reduce, and that she would likely remain that way for several days. He said the word optimistic 3 times in 10 minutes, and I held on to that word like it was a rope. Derek was not there. He had not been there when we arrived. He was not there while we waited through the surgery. We called him. My wife called him twice, and I called him once, and each time it went to voicemail. The hospital had contacted him as her emergency contact when she first came in, and according to the intake nurse, he had said he was on his way. He was not on his way. He finally appeared the next morning, around 9 o'clock. He walked in looking tired but not devastated, not the way a man looks when his wife is lying in a coma. He hugged my wife. He shook my hand. He asked the nurse a few questions. He said he'd been stuck in a meeting that ran long and his phone had died. He said all the right things, in the right order, and I watched him say them, and I thought about that word charming, and I felt something cold move through my chest. He stayed for about 2 hours that first morning. Then he said he had to handle some things at the office. He'd be back in the evening. He did not come back in the evening. He came back the following morning, again for about 2 hours. Then he left again. By the third day, I was no longer trying to be charitable about it. My wife made excuses for him. She said he was probably handling everything at home, making sure the bills were paid, taking care of the dog, keeping things running so that when Caroline woke up, she wouldn't have to deal with a pile of problems. I listened to my wife say these things, and I nodded, and I did not tell her what I was actually thinking. What I was actually thinking was, something is wrong. It was a feeling I couldn't name, just a vibration in the back of my mind, low and persistent, the way you can sometimes sense a storm coming before the sky has changed. I watched Derek come and go, always with a reason, always with his phone in his hand, always with that easy composure that had stopped looking like confidence and started looking like performance. I noticed that he never sat at her bedside and held her hand. I noticed that when he looked at her, he didn't look the way I looked at her. He looked like a man checking something off a list. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, my wife mentioned something in passing. She said her sister had called. Her sister lives in Asheville and keeps track of the local real estate listings because she has always wanted to move to Raleigh, and she'd seen something strange. She'd seen a listing for a property in Caroline's neighborhood, a house that matched the description of the one Caroline and Derek owned together. I asked my wife to send me the listing. She did. It was their house. There was no question. The address was right there, though the listing had a slightly different arrangement of details, the kind of shuffling that someone does when they're hoping you won't connect the dots immediately. The photos were interior shots I recognized. The kitchen where I'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. The back porch where I'd sat with my daughter last summer. The two of us drinking sweet tea and watching the sun go down over the tree line. The listing had gone live 2 days ago, 2 days after the accident, while his wife was in a coma. I sat with that information for a long time. I sat with it in the plastic chair next to my daughter's bed, and I listened to the machines breathe for her, and I looked at her face, which was bruised and swollen, but still so completely her face, still the face of the little girl who used to fall asleep watching movies on my shoulder, and I felt something that I don't have a clean word for. It was grief and rage at the same time. It was the feeling of watching something terrible happen in slow motion and not being able to stop it yet. I did not say anything to my wife. Not yet. I needed to understand more before I started a fire I couldn't control. That was the morning I got the text. I stepped off the elevator on the 3rd floor and walked to the nurse's station and asked for Elena. The woman behind the desk looked up and studied my face for a moment before she picked up the phone and said something quietly into it. Then she told me to wait. Elena was not a nurse. She was a small woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of stillness about her that suggested she was very good at listening and very careful about what she said. She introduced herself and asked me to follow her to a small conference room down the hall. She closed the door. She sat across from me and put her hands flat on the table. She said, "Mr. Hartley, your daughter asked me to contact you if something happened to her before she was ready." I said, "Ready for what?" Elena said, "She's been working with me for the past 5 months. I'm a licensed private investigator. Your daughter hired me last spring because she suspected her husband was planning to defraud her." I heard the words. I understood the words individually. It took me a few seconds to assemble them into something I could fully absorb. She continued. She spoke carefully and methodically, the way people do when they've practiced delivering difficult information. She said that Caroline had first become suspicious about 14 months ago, when she found a document on the shared printer at home that she wasn't supposed to see. It was a summary of an account she didn't recognize, held in Derek's name alone, with a balance that was substantially larger than it should have been given what she knew of their finances. She'd started quietly paying attention after that. She'd noticed transfers from their joint accounts to accounts she couldn't trace. She'd noticed that the mortgage on their house had been refinanced twice in the past 2 years without her full understanding of the terms. She'd discovered that Derek had taken out a life insurance policy on her 3 years ago with a payout of $900,000. She said that word "discovered" the way you say it when you're trying to stay professional. But I could hear the weight underneath it. My daughter had found out that her husband had insured her life for nearly $1 million. My daughter had hired a private investigator instead of panicking. My daughter, who was 34 years old and taught 7-year-olds to read, had spent 5 months quietly and methodically building a case while continuing to live in that house and sleep in that bed and smile at that man across the dinner table. I thought about her laugh, the way it fills up a whole room. I thought about how much courage that takes to know what you know and still function, still wait, still gather what you need. I had to clear my throat before I could speak. I asked Elena what happened to the documentation. She said that Caroline had given her access to a secure file-sharing system and that everything, the financial records, the insurance policy, photographs, a written account of everything Caroline had observed was already in the hands of her personal attorney, a woman named Susan Park, who was prepared to act the moment she received word. She said Caroline had also already made contact with a detective in the Raleigh Financial Crimes Division who had been quietly reviewing what she'd put together. She said Caroline had been 3 weeks away from confronting him, 3 weeks away from sitting down with her attorney and her detective and walking out of that marriage with the evidence she needed to pursue criminal charges. Then the accident happened. Elena said that Derek had called her Elena the day after the accident. He had found her number in Caroline's phone, in a contact saved under a fake name. He hadn't identified himself on the call. He'd simply asked, in a very measured voice, whether Elena was someone his wife had been speaking with recently. Elena had said she was a college friend and she hadn't spoken to Caroline in months. She'd hung up and immediately sent the text from a burner phone she kept for situations like this, using a message that Caroline had pre-written for exactly this scenario. I stared at the table. I was thinking about all the things I hadn't known. I was thinking about all the times I'd looked at my daughter at family dinners and holidays and asked how things were going, and she'd smiled and said, "Fine, everything's fine," and she had been carrying all of this entirely alone. I asked Elena, "Does she know the accident wasn't an accident?" She looked at me steadily. She said she didn't know that for certain. She said the police were treating it as a traffic incident. She said the driver who ran the red light had no prior record and no apparent connection to Derek and had been cooperative with investigators. She said, "But your daughter believed he was capable of it. That's why she moved when she did." I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked what I needed to do. Over the next 48 hours, I did something that went against every instinct I had. I continued to behave normally. I sat at my daughter's bedside. I drank bad hospital coffee. I made small talk with the nurses. When Derek came by for his 2-hour visits, I looked at him and nodded and answered his questions about Caroline's progress and did not let my face show a single thing I was feeling. This was the hardest thing I have ever done. I have been in difficult situations in my life. I served in the army for 4 years when I was young. I buried my father and my brother, and I watched my wife go through a cancer scare that lasted 11 months before it resolved. I know what it means to hold yourself together when everything in you wants to fall apart. But nothing tested me the way those 48 hours did, because every time Derek walked into that room, I had to look at him, and I had to see what I now knew, and I had to keep it inside. I watched him more carefully now. I noticed things I'd been trying to explain away before. He was on his phone constantly, but not in the way of a man managing his grief. He made calls in the hallway, brief ones, and he spoke quietly. And when he came back into the room, his expression reset almost immediately, like a screen refreshing. I watched him look at Caroline, lying there in that bed, and I watched the way he calculated rather than felt. Behind the scenes, things were moving. Susan Park, the attorney, filed emergency motions to freeze the joint accounts and flag the house listing. The real estate company was contacted directly. The listing was pulled within 24 hours. The detective in Raleigh Financial Crimes, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment, executed a warrant for Derek's financial records. Elena stayed in close contact with me through a phone she gave me on the morning we first met, a separate line that I kept in my jacket pocket. On the evening of the second day, my wife noticed I was distracted and asked me if I was all right. I told her I was exhausted. She took my hand and we sat together in the waiting room, and she didn't say anything else, and I was grateful for that, because I was not certain I could have maintained the performance under direct questioning from the person who knows me better than anyone alive. I prayed for my daughter every night. I prayed the way I hadn't prayed since my brother died, which is to say with everything I had, with the kind of desperation that makes prayer less of a ritual and more of a demand. I sat next to her bed in the dark, after visiting hours, after the nurses had done their checks and the floor had gone quiet, and I held her hand and I talked to her. I told her about what Elena had told me. I told her that her people were moving. I told her that she had been braver than I had any idea, and that I was sorry I hadn't known, and that I was proud of her in a way I couldn't fully put into words. Whether she heard any of it, I don't know. On the morning of day 6, Derek arrived at the hospital at his usual time, but something was different. He came in faster than usual, and his composure, that unshakable composure, had a hairline crack in it. His jaw was tight. He looked at his phone twice in the first 5 minutes. He asked me, with a casualness that was working too hard, whether I'd spoken to anyone about Caroline's finances recently. I said no. I said I wasn't really the kind of person who got involved in other people's financial matters. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded and said that was smart. He said he was just thinking about making sure things were handled properly, in case her recovery took longer than expected. He said he wanted to make sure the bills were paid. I said that sounded like a good idea. He left after 40 minutes. That was shorter than usual. 2 hours later, Elena called me and said the detective had brought Derek in for questioning. I walked down to the hospital chapel on the first floor. I sat in one of the pews, and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself feel everything I had been holding back for the past 6 days. The fear for my daughter, the rage at what Derek had been doing, at what he might have intended, at the scope of it, the disbelief that someone could sit in a room with a woman he had married and calculate her value in terms of an insurance payout. The grief for my daughter's last 6 years, for everything she had navigated alone. I stayed in that chapel for 20 minutes. Then I washed my face in the small bathroom off the side and went back upstairs. Caroline came out of the coma on the morning of day 8. She opened her eyes slowly, the way you do when you're not sure where you are yet, and she blinked at the light, and then she turned her head slightly, and she saw me. Her face did something complicated. I had her hand in both of mine. I was already crying before she tried to speak. The doctor had told us that the first words after this kind of event are often disoriented, or a simple repeated phrase, or sometimes nothing coherent at all. He had prepared us for the possibility that she would need time to fully resurface. What Caroline said, in a voice like dry paper, was, "Did Elena reach you?" I laughed. I couldn't help it. I laughed through the tears and I said, "Yes, she reached me." And my daughter's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. The next several weeks were not simple. Nothing about this kind of situation is simple once you get past the moment of revelation and into the reality of what comes after. Recovery from a traumatic brain injury is slow and nonlinear. There were good days and days that rolled back what the good days had built. Caroline had headaches that she described as trying to think through a wall of static. She had gaps in her short-term memory that frightened her more than the physical pain. She had to relearn certain sequences of words, certain pathways of logic, and watching her work at it was both difficult and extraordinary, because she worked at it the way she works at everything with that stubbornness that she got from me, which I have never been more grateful to have passed on. Derek's situation developed the way these things do, which is to say slowly and with more paperwork than drama. He was formally arrested 6 weeks after the accident. The charges included wire fraud, financial exploitation, and once investigators dug deeper into the timeline, insurance fraud, because it turned out the policy on Caroline's life was not the only one he had been operating. There was another policy on a business partner from 2 years prior, which had resulted in a payout after that man died in what had been ruled an accident, and which investigators were now re-examining with considerably more scrutiny. I will not pretend I understood everything that came out in the months that followed. Financial crimes move through a maze of documents and terminology that I am not equipped to navigate without a guide, and Susan Park became that guide for our family. What I understood was the shape of it. Derek had been methodically liquidating the life my daughter had built, and he had planned to be done with her before she figured out what was happening. The accident may have been his attempt to accelerate that timeline. The investigation into that specific question was still ongoing as of the last time I spoke to the detective. What I do know is that Caroline had been smarter than him. She had been paying attention while he thought she wasn't. She had moved carefully and thoroughly while maintaining the appearance of a woman who didn't suspect anything, which is an exhausting and lonely thing to do. And she had done it for 5 months, and she had built something that could not be dismantled or denied. She told me about those 5 months one evening in early winter, when she had recovered enough to sit up in the small recliner by the window in her hospital room and speak in full sentences without losing her train of thought. She told me about finding the document on the printer. She told me about the nights she'd lain awake running numbers in her head, checking and rechecking what she knew against what she could prove. She told me about hiring Elena, and about the fear she'd carried knowing that if Derek discovered any of it, she would be in immediate danger, and how she had learned to wall off that fear into a separate room of herself and keep the door closed during the day. She told me she hadn't told me because she hadn't wanted me to do something that would tip him off. She knew, she said. She knew me. She knew that if I'd found out, I would not have been able to sit across a dinner table from Derek and pretend. She said this with a gentle, apologetic smile, like she was delivering a verdict she'd been sitting with for a while. She was right. She was absolutely right, and we both knew it. I told her that the next time she decided to conduct a 5-month covert financial investigation, she could at least let me know she was doing it. She said she would take that under advisement. We looked at each other, and I was aware, in a way that happens rarely in a life, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Right there, in that moment, in that cold hospital room with the winter light coming through the window. I said, "You scared me." She said, "I know, Dad. I'm sorry." I said, "Don't apologize. Just get better." She said she was working on it. She was discharged 3 weeks before Christmas. My wife and I drove her home, not to her house, which was in the middle of a legal dispute and which she had no desire to return to, but to our house in Charlotte, to her old room, to the place where she had grown up. She slept for the first 2 days in the way of someone who has been running on emergency reserves for a very long time and has finally been given permission to stop. On the 3rd morning, she came downstairs for breakfast and sat at the kitchen table and asked me to make her the scrambled eggs I used to make when she was a kid, the ones with the sharp cheddar and too much butter. And I made them, and she ate them, and she looked out the kitchen window at the bare December trees in the backyard, and she said, almost to herself, "I thought I had more time." I said, "For what?" She said, "To figure it out myself, before anyone else had to get involved." I thought about that for a while. I thought about what it means to want to handle something yourself, to want to be the one who resolves your own problem, to not want to need saving. I understood that impulse better than she probably knew. I said, "You did figure it out yourself. We just executed the last part of your plan." She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. She nodded, slowly, like she was accepting something she'd been resistant to. The legal proceedings were still ongoing at that point. They would continue for many months more. Derek hired a defense attorney who was skilled at slowing things down, at filing motions and requesting continuances, and generally making the machinery move as slowly as possible. But the evidence was thorough. It had been assembled by my daughter with exactly the precision and patience that she brings to everything she cares about, and it was not going away. There is a particular kind of helplessness that comes with being a parent. It doesn't go away when your children grow up, it transforms. When they are small, you can fix most things. You can pick them up when they fall. You can stand between them and danger. But when they are adults, and the danger is something they are navigating in the interior of a life you are not fully present in, you cannot stand between it. You can only hope that what you gave them was enough, that the stubbornness, the patience, the willingness to look clearly at difficult truths, that those things took root. I watched my daughter at the kitchen table that December morning, and I thought about all of it. I thought about the man she had trusted enough to marry. I thought about the months she'd spent watching him while he thought she couldn't see. I thought about the text message that had come from her phone while she was unconscious. The text she'd arranged in advance because she had thought of this contingency, because she had thought of all the contingencies, because she is thorough in the way that only people who have been deeply careful for a long time can be. I thought about the feeling of holding her hand in that dark hospital room at 2 in the morning, talking to her without knowing if she could hear me. I thought about saying to her that I was proud of her in a way I couldn't fully put into words. I still can't fully put it into words, but I'll try. I'm proud of her because she was afraid and she did it anyway. I'm proud of her because she chose to gather evidence instead of rage. I'm proud of her because she thought about how to protect herself. And then she actually did it, methodically, without drama, without asking anyone to save her. I'm proud of her because when she woke up with a brain bleed and a tube in her throat and a husband being questioned by detectives downstairs, the first thing she said was a question about whether her plan had reached the right person. She gets the stubbornness from me. She gets the laugh from her mother, the patience and the precision and the courage to stay calm while everything is on fire. I don't know exactly where she got those. Maybe they were always in her. Maybe you can't trace that kind of thing back to anyone. She went back to teaching in March. Her students made her a card that covered most of the classroom door, signed in the enormous, effortful handwriting of 7-year-olds, covered in drawings of her in various configurations of happiness. She sent me a photo of it. I printed it out and put it on the refrigerator in Charlotte, which is something I haven't done with a piece of art since she was in elementary school herself. I look at it most mornings when I'm making coffee. Derek's trial was set for the following fall. By then, the investigation into his former business partner's death had widened in ways that I won't speculate on here, because there are things still unresolved, and I've learned the hard way that speculation is a different thing from knowing, and I want to be careful about the line between them. What I'll say is this. The detective we'd been working with told me, the last time we spoke, that the case was considerably more significant than a straightforward financial fraud. He said it with the particular tone of a man who is trying not to say more than he should. I said I understood. He said my daughter had done something remarkable. He said that in his experience, the documentation she'd assembled was among the most thorough he'd seen from a private citizen working without access to legal tools. He said she had essentially handed them the architecture of the whole thing and then had the misfortune of a car accident before she could finish what she'd started. I said she had finished it. She just needed to wait a little while to see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought that was probably the right way to look at it. I drive to Raleigh every few weeks now, since Caroline moved into a new apartment on the north side of the city, close to her school. It's a nice apartment. She painted the living room a deep green, which would not have been my choice, but it suits her. She has a kitchen table where she does her grading on Sunday evenings, and a back porch where we sit when I visit, and she drinks her coffee and I drink mine, and we talk about whatever comes up, which is everything and nothing, the way conversation goes when there's nothing left that needs to be hidden. I don't bring up Derek unless she brings him up first. She mentions the case occasionally, factually, the way you give an update on something being handled. She doesn't dwell on it. I've noticed that about her, the not dwelling. She moves forward with a kind of deliberateness that I find alternately inspiring and humbling, because I am, by nature, a person who tends to carry things, and she seems to have figured out some system for setting them down that I haven't fully learned. One evening last spring, we were sitting on that back porch, and she said, out of nowhere, "I know you watched him for those 2 days and didn't say anything." I said I had. She said, "That was hard for you." I said it was. She looked out at the yard, at the trees going dark, at the edges, in the early evening. She said, "Thank you." I said she didn't need to thank me for that. She said, "I know. I'm thanking you anyway." We sat in the quiet for a while after that, the two of us with our coffee, the sky going orange and then purple over the rooftops. It was the kind of evening that you know you're going to carry around for a long time. Not because anything significant happened in it, but because the person next to you is alive and whole and sitting there, and a few months ago that wasn't certain, and you haven't entirely stopped being grateful. I don't know exactly what comes next. The legal process will run its course. My daughter will keep teaching and keep growing and keep doing the things that have always been characteristic of her, which is to say, she will move through the world with more clarity and intention than most people manage. She'll probably be fine. She is more than fine. She is the kind of person who takes the worst thing that's ever happened to her and extracts from it something that makes her harder to break. I am 63 years old. I have been a father for 34 of those years, and I still don't entirely know what I'm doing. I still wake up some nights thinking about that phone screen, about those words, "Dad, come to my house now," about what would have happened if I'd let it go to voicemail. I think about the timing of it, about the particular alignment of things that had to go right. I think about my daughter lying in that hospital bed, trusting that the plan she'd set in motion would find its way to the right hands. It did. Maybe that's the thing I want to say, underneath everything else. That you can plan and prepare and build your case with everything you have. And sometimes the plan still requires another person to pick up the thread at exactly the right moment. And that asking for help, even in the form of a pre-written text to a phone you can't reach, is not weakness. It's just knowing that no one makes it through entirely alone. Caroline made it through. And so, I think, did I?